y'all might have noticed I shaved my head. You know what? There ain't barbers in quarantine. So how about that? Don't hate the shaved head, hate the quarantine, alright? Today, I'm going to be showing you guys a little bit about how I properly set ride height on my Honda Civic race car. Before setting your ride height, there's some considerations that need to be thought through. The first one is, what ride height do I set my car at? The best thing to do is talk to someone with a similarly set up car, with similar goals. And you say, what ride height do you run at? But you can ask them questions about how the car handles, you can ask them questions about what the car has on it, and you can use that as a starting point for tweaking your own ride height. Because at the end of the day, any setting you're going to make to your car, almost any setting, is going to be partially dependent on driver feel. Other things to consider when setting ride height. You want to consider reliability. So if you're slamming your car, yeah, you're lowering the roll center, right? And the car is going to have less body roll. So in theory, it'll be faster. The first thing that's going to affect is the reliability of the car. And I'm not just talking about scraping over bumps and stuff, but I mean like, so your axles might be up like this, right? And what's going to happen is you're going to put more stress on the axles and you're just going to be blowing axles left and right if you slam your car. The next thing to take into consideration when you're setting up your car is geometry changes, right? For example, on many McPherson strut cars, when you overly lower them, what happens is you get positive camber change under compression. So you're losing camber under compression because your car is too low. You're so obsessed with reducing body roll, being low and aerodynamic. You're so focused on that you forget about making the tire happy. You know, the biggest thing is you gotta make the tire happy. Some cars, when they're lowered too much, they get bump steer because the tie rods sit at an awkward angle. So what's going to happen is under compression, your toe is going to change and you're going to have slightly unpredictable handling. Probably the last thing that you need to take into consideration is whether or not you've done it correctly or whether or not you know how to do it correctly. When you're setting ride height, there's a lot of factors involved that combat the compression of the suspension. You might say that my ride height is 5.5 inches to the pinch weld. You might be wrong, because then you might come back a week later and it might be 5.25 and you're like, well, what? There's lots of stuff that's binding up when you're first compressing that suspension, and there's ways to get around that, and I'll show you that in this video. Your tires, right? That's the first thing. So as the car compresses, the tires are going to want to push out. They're trying to push out and they're not pushing out because they're made of rubber. The second thing is bushings, all right? So most cars have rubber bushings. You might have poly bushings in your car. Great, but what if it's not greased? Even if you have spherical bushings in some parts of the car, it's still a good idea to take into account all of the points of stiction for your suspension articulation points before setting your ride height. Another thing, sway bars. If your front right side is slightly higher than your front left, you're not going to notice the difference as much if the sway bars are still connected to the control arms, because your right tire is going to want to travel with your left because the sway bar is tying them together. So you need to disconnect the sway bars before you set ride height correctly. You also need to take into account the top hats on your shocks, right? Like if your springs are sitting up against a urethane top hat isolator and they're trying to compress, they're going to get stuck because as they're compressing, the spring is turning, right? So that top hat's going to prevent that spring from turning. The other things that you need to take into consideration are, do you have your body weight in the driver's seat? Are your tires pumped up? Are you on the tires that you normally use for racing? In this technique that I'm about to show you, I really haven't had many issues. The car turns good left just like it does right. I've been able to repeatably set ride height to a given setting, and then when the suspension is all tightened up and back together, I come back in a week and it hasn't changed. So, with that being said, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the sources of stiction. First thing we're going to look at is the sway bar. Alright, now I got the car up in the air, and we're going to check for all of the bushings to make sure they're all loose. now one thing I do want to say is this car has a spherical compliance bushing, which I'll show you guys. So I didn't need to loosen up the compliance bushing up front, but if you are going to be setting ride height on a Honda specifically like this, and it has a rubber compliance bushing, loosen it up. Alright, and then this is the upper control arm. Ideally, you loosen up the bolt that goes through here, and then the bolt that goes through here. I already greased those up, so they move pretty freely, but eventually it'd be a good idea to get some spherical for that. Also worthwhile noting is this car does not have a front sway bar. If it did have a front sway bar, we would be disconnecting that too. We got all the suspension components loosened up on the car. Now it's time to drop it onto the ground and create our quote-unquote frictionless surface. So earlier in the video, you might remember me talking about how the tire is going to limit the ability of the suspension to compress. To fix that, we put something slippery in between the tire and the ground. We call that our frictionless surface because it removes the friction of the tire. The most common thing you're going to see is a turn plate, and a turn plate is what they use when you drive your car to an alignment shop and they put it up on the rack. Used, they might go for about $200 for a set of hobbyist turn plates from like Longacre Racing, and I think new they go for $400 to $500, but don't quote me on that. And that's probably going to be one of your best performing options, but it's also a little bit more expensive. I am going to be going with the DIY budget solution, and for that there's a couple of options. The first one would be linoleum tiles. What you do is you go to Home Depot and you get two, I think these are 12 by 12 tiles, and you put grease in between the two slippery sides. Put the car on top of this side, and then this side faces the ground, and the grease allows it to slide. I've done that for probably 4 years through autocrossing and track days aligning my own car, and it's worked fairly well. But there are other options too that might be cheaper or better performing. The option that I most recently stumbled upon though was vinyl siding from construction sites. My friend, thank you Alex, used to be a supervisor at a construction site, and he brought home some vinyl siding, and we cut it up into tiles, and then we greased in between the tiles like this, just regular axle grease, and then you park the car on top of here, and then this side sees the ground, and when you compress it, when the suspension compresses, that slides out. Some other options, if you don't have that stuff laying around, are sheet metal. I got that tip from a friend who used to work at a reputable speed shop in North Jersey, and they would put grease in between two pieces of sheet metal, and just like the other stuff, it would allow the tires to move really easily. The last thing that I've seen people do is I've seen people take garbage bags filled with grease, and same thing. But like I said, I'm going to be using the vinyl siding. It works fairly well. I think it works better than the linoleum tiles. If you guys have any tips or tricks, leave a comment below. I'd love to see what kind of solutions you guys are using to set ride height on your car. See how it just turns freely? It's because the tires are on frictionless surfaces. Ta-da! Alright, so the next thing that we gotta do is we gotta get my body weight in the driver's seat. I weigh 190 pounds, so what I do is I go to Home Depot and I get 50-pound bags of gravel, and I put 4 of them in my driver's seat. The passenger side ballast is all in there, and then I'll show you some more stuff. So this mess that I have right here in my driver's seat is actually just a tarp to prevent sand from getting in my seat, and then 4 bags of Quikrete gravel. And then as you can see, I have my ballast in here. So this car is almost set up like it would be in race trim. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to fill up the tires to where they would be at if they were at the hot pressures. I'm gonna take all the crap out of the car, and then we're going to bounce it up and down an equal number of times, front and rear. I do 3 times, and then we will start measuring ride height. Go for it. We got Anthony here. Hey. Anthony races in H2. Yeah, he came to help me out a little bit today. Or just watch. Either way, he brought beer.
So what are we doing?
Well, Anthony, I'm about to tell you. So we're setting ride height front or rear first before we worry about anything else. Now, the reason that that's significant to say is because your ride height on the front left might be different from your front right. All right? And so what you do is you measure the average ride height between the two, and then if it's too low, you raise both sides at the same time. If it's too high, you lower both sides at the same time. Same thing goes for the rear. Generally, they're going to be close enough, right, that maybe there's a difference of a 1/4 inch at most between the two sides. Otherwise, you'd really notice it with, visually. If there is that difference, what you're going to do after that is you're going to set the corners to where you want it to be at. All right, so I got this block of wood here, and I wrote my ride heights on it. The driver rear was at 5 3/16, and then the passenger rear was at 5 1/4. So 5.21875 average ride height in the rear. The cool thing about having a graphing calculator like this is you can go and you can easily convert it to a fraction without having to do like any sort of long math. So it's going to be 5 7/32 is the average ride height in the rear. So this is a BC Racing coilover. It has 3 spanner nuts, whatever you want to call them. These 2 control preload of the spring. The top one is the spring seat. You tighten it up to get preload on the spring, and then the bottom one locks it in place. This one down here basically locks this shock insert into the body down here. All right, so you loosen this up, you turn the whole entire shock insert, and then that controls the ride height of the car. Once you're done, you tighten this up. But before I do any of this, I'm gonna mark everything to make sure that I know if it loosened up, how many turns I'm putting on it when I'm adjusting ride height. To mark a lot of the stuff on my car, I use these whiteout pens that you can get from the dollar store. I like these because they're cheap and the paint lasts for a while. I marked where the preload is set, and that's going to tell me if they loosened up. We're going to mark this on the body, and that'll tell us if this loosened up relative to the body. And then finally, we're going to go and mark the shock insert, the threaded shock insert. And you can see it's not perfect, but we just want to have an understanding of how many turns we're putting on the shock insert relative to the shock body. This way we can say, okay, I did 1 turn over here, we'll do 1 turn on the other side, the same left and right on the rear. We adjusted the left side and the right side the same amount at the coilover. The next step you're going to do is you're going to lower the car back onto the frictionless surface. You're going to bounce it up and down a couple times, and then you're going to measure the ride height on the left side, the right side, and you're going to get the average ride height. One of 2 things are going to happen in this scenario. A, car is going to be too high. B, car is going to be too low. The chances that you measure a ride height that's exactly in line with what you expected are very low, especially when you're working on an uneven garage floor like this, or when you're working without turn plates, or when you're working with a car that's on old rubber bushings. The exceptions go on and on. The important thing is that you have a tolerance in mind. Let's say that you wanted to be 5 inches from the ground. Well, you might be 5 1/4 inches from the ground. In that case, you might want to lower the car a little bit. You might also find that you're 5 1/16 inches from the ground. The 1/16 of an inch is pretty good when you're considering all the variables that are going on. We're not setting up Formula 1 cars here. We're not setting up Indy cars. We're setting up track cars so you can have fun on track with your friends. Alright, so now we are up here at the fronts. And again, we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to mark this body right here. Mark the collar, even though we don't really need to, because it's not locked in place yet. And then we're going to mark this shock body. And again, this is how you adjust the ride height. Here, you turn the shock insert, and then this is for preload up here, these top ones. The same procedure applies to the front. You're going to adjust it in equal amount in the front, you're going to put it on the frictionless surface, bounce it up and down, measure the ride heights, and then repeat as necessary. Alright, so let me read you the ride heights. Driver front, we got 5 inches from the ground to the pinch weld. Driver rear, we got 4 7/8 from the ground to the pinch weld. Passenger rear, we got 5 inches from the ground to the pinch weld. And then passenger front, we got 4 7/8 from the ground to the pinch weld. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you have to have a tolerance when you're setting this stuff up. Do I want it to be perfect? Yeah, I want it to be perfect. Does it need to be perfect? It depends on the application. After setting the ride height to this degree, some people might take the car and they might corner balance it to make sure that the corner weights are even. For my purposes, this will do just fine. The next thing we gotta do is we gotta tighten up all of the suspension joints that we loosened up on the car. However, as you can see, there's really not a lot of room to get underneath the car and tighten things up. To remedy the clearance situation, I put the car up on cinder blocks. Cinder blocks are like $3 or $4 from Home Depot. You put the car up on top of the cinder block with the frictionless surface in between the tire and the cinder block, and it allows the tires to compress. It also gives you the clearance that you need so that you can tighten up the suspension joints. The dangerous thing is that cinder blocks are not designed to hold up cars. So I always put a couple tires underneath the car in case the cinder blocks do fail or the car rolls off so that I don't get hurt. Alright, as you can see, she is up on cinder blocks. And I am supporting her with 2 tires in the middle, 2 jacks, front and rear. The worst part about doing this is it's a ton of work without a lift and on this nasty floor. After you're done all of it, if you have a lot of attention to detail like I do, you get mad because like you go to reattach the sway bar, for example, and you got to do like 3 or 4 turns on one side versus the other, and you're like, oh well, I must not have set the ride height equal enough. It goes back to the tolerance discussion that we had, where it's like you really have to have a tolerance in mind that you're okay with settling for. And for me, the tolerance is like if the back of my head and the back of my shirt is covered in mud and, you know, dirt to the point where I'm like I need to go home and drink some water or something, then that's my tolerance point. But I'm going to show you guys some of the hardest points that I had to get to under the car. Putting on the sway bar, it was, you know, tightening up the camber arms. But I'm going to show you guys that under the car real quick. Alright guys, it's late, it's dark outside, it's past my bedtime. I did the best I could with the circumstances that I'm in. Throughout the whole video I was thinking of things that I could have done better. Could have gotten a more level surface, could have got the car up on a higher and safer platform with better frictionless surface like actual turn plates. Could have used an actual ride height gauge from Longacre Racing. I could have gotten the ride height closer to where I wanted to get it. If you guys do have any comments or suggestions, good or bad, drop them down in the comment section below. You know, if you did like what you saw, like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification button. Thank you for coming to the EJ2 Track Rat channel. I hope you guys learned something low buck and DIY on how to get your car ready for the track. Thanks for watching.